So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. As I said, my name is Vicki Ibanez. I work for Red Wind Consulting, and I've been working to end violence against Native women for probably about the last 26 or 27 years. And in that work, have participated in a few projects that are called safety and accountability audits. And it's actually a method that was developed by Praxis International, who is a national technical assistance provider for rural programs through the Office on Violence Against Women. And that safety and accountability audit is a method of institutional ethnography that really looks intensely at a portion of the system to see how that system's response is enhancing safety and holding offenders accountable. And through that, one of the things that started emerging was the benefits of different kinds of mapping. And so for the purpose of our time together today, I'm going to talk about two areas of mapping the response. And so when we think about mapping, basically it's a tool that helps us to understand the local situation and collect data and expand our knowledge base. And in doing that, we get to see a more comprehensive look at our community response to domestic violence and sexual assault that we may not be able to see otherwise without looking more closely at it. So for instance, we may know that there is a crisis response program for sexual assault, or we may know where the domestic violence advocates are, but we aren't aware of the fact that there are other types of practitioners in the community that are engaged and skilled in different kinds of domestic violence and sexual assault responses. So the mapping really helps us to get a much stronger understanding and really broaden our picture of the community. For the purpose of this presentation, I mentioned that I was going to focus in two areas, and one of them is around community assets, and the other is about case processing. And what I'm going to do is I'll talk about community assets first and describe the mapping that goes from within the context of looking at the community assets, and then follow that by focusing on case processing. There is a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, there's a lot of distinctive differences. So when we talk about community assets and mapping the assets in the community, we're talking about looking at the broad range of assets available. And a lot of times when people think about assets, I know for myself, I have a background in economics as well from my college days. And so I think about assets sometimes in different ways, but really talking about what are the tools, the resources, the supports that we have in the community that we can use to strengthen and enhance our response. And so when we think about asset mapping, what we do is we're defining our boundaries. And so oftentimes when we think of community as we sit down together in a group, we may have different definitions of what community, of the geographical boundaries of our community. One person may think, okay, that the boundaries stay within our town. Another person says, well, you know, we have to take into account multiple jurisdictions, so we're actually talking about crossing county lines, crossing tribal lines, maybe even crossing state lines. And then another person may say, well, for the purpose of our boundaries, for me, I think about just on the reservation and not any of the surrounding communities. So as a community, as a group of people that are looking at mapping out their assets for their domestic violence and sexual assault response, the critical piece is to first start by defining your boundaries. So what is your community that you're going to map? How do you define that? And then with that, brainstorm the point you want to look at. So, and what I mean by that is when you think about domestic violence response and sexual assault response, you're talking about some really broad things. So if you're talking about like all of the areas, all of the supports in the community that could respond to sexual assault, or you could even be saying all of the supports in the community that are first responders to sexual assault. Or you could talk about all of the supports in the community that are the long-term supports for sexual assault victims. So when you think about that point that you want to look at, again, as a group that's engaged in asset mapping the response, you really want to get clear about what is it you want to look at. And then with that, then you want to identify each possible response. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a couple slides. And then with that, identifying the assets within each of those response points. So for instance, if one of the things you're looking at is the law enforcement response point, then you want to identify the range of different assets that you have within those response points. And when you think about the assets, you also, as you're moving through and identifying what do you have, you also want to be thinking about what do you not have, so that you're starting to uncover some of the gaps and parts that are missing in the response. And then the last point in the steps are the IOUs. And those just simply are that you identify, and so what you want, and that connects to both the pieces that I was saying in terms of looking at the deficiencies and the assets or the resources. And then the O is organizing, and in that, as you're talking about the resources that you have in the community, the assets that you have in the community, you want to be organizing a means to be able to build the relationships and the connections so that that you can actually strengthen the response. And then thirdly, out of the IOUs is to utilize and to put to use. So for instance, if you identify that in the local church, you actually have a resource where particularly, I know in some communities that some of the organized religion and faith-based practitioners are utilized more frequently. And so you might think that within a church, as you identify them as an asset in your community, you might identify, well, in this particular Lutheran church, we know that the minister has been well trained on domestic violence, and in that, then what we aren't doing is we aren't connecting, we aren't communicating, we aren't exchanging in a way that the minister is actually connected into the work that we're doing, so that that minister can serve as a solid referral, or can be referring people into an advocacy program, or referring people to the healthcare facility for medical attention in ways that are most helpful. And vice versa, say for instance from the healthcare facility or even the advocacy program, they could be turning around and seeing that knowing about this resource within this church could become a really good referral for working with victims, to be able to say, if this is a faith direction that you personally choose, here's a way that we can connect you. And so building those relationships and establishing connections are really a critical part of it as you identify these assets. And then with that is actually putting it to use. And so a lot of people say, well, the implementation of it. Well, it's actually more than that. It's implementation for me. Oftentimes I think about you're kind of starting up and building from there. The putting to use is that you're really engaged and you're actually really using it. So we want to think about the IOUs as well. So I wanted to describe a little bit of the assets, the kind of assets that you're looking for. So as you think about the community response to domestic violence and sexual assault, and you're out there kind of taking your inventory, identifying the different kinds of things that you have, you want to think about the major ethnic, racial, and cultural groups within your community. So as we're doing our work, you know, we may within, say for instance, like the Wind River Reservation. Wind River has 2 tribes, and there's some distinct relationship differences between the 2 tribes and their interactions. So it's important to know that and to understand some of how that plays itself out. And then with that, then as you're considering your response, then you might want to think about, so are you just working with the true tribes, or are there other populations that may come into play? As you identify the tribes, do you have a population within the tribe that speak their own language, and with that there's a little bit of a communication loss that could happen when you're speaking only and communicating only in English. And so you want to understand that your local populations. Who are you talking about? Then you also want to think about the individual assets. So as we look at and we scan within our boundaries, we want to think about all of the different kinds of skills, the talents that we have, the experiences, the professional capacities, and so on. So for instance, thinking about domestic violence responses, one of the things that tends to be critical issues as a relationship is being dissolved, that oftentimes there might be custody issues. So having some resource around the professional response as an attorney is a valuable asset. So we want to think about all of that, not just staying within the realm of, oh, here's our community advocacy program and these are the skills and assets and talents and experiences they have. We do want to know that, but we also want to know about the other kinds of skills and assets and experiences that we have in the community. Then we want to think about our institutional assets. And so that ranges from, you know, some of the healthcare providers that we have in terms of our hospitals and our clinics, some of our mental health or behavioral health programs that we have. Law enforcement would be an institutional asset, and with law enforcement, an arm of that would be the prosecution response. So we want to really identify those different kinds of assets. Another institutional asset might be a community college or a university or a tribal college in the area. As we think about those kinds of assets. So for instance, I know particularly in urban areas, but also in some rural tribal areas, a college that might be in the area provides a range of different resources. One thing that I always want to lean toward is the student internship responsibilities that students need to engage in to be able to utilize some of their energy to be able to take on some projects. As well, some of the campus programs have some very extensive sexual assault responses. And so as we think about the institutional assets, we really want to be thinking about the assets in a way that goes back to the point that we're looking at. Are we looking at the resources around, you know, the first responders to domestic violence or sexual assault, you know, whatever point we decided we wanted to look at. And then the organizational assets, talking about things such as our advocacy programs, our crisis response programs, other nonprofits. One of the nonprofit areas that I see that comes up frequently happens to be those that work with homeless and poverty, because oftentimes women or victims or survivors who are seeking assistance are, those that have some of the least amount of resources. So those nonprofits that work with poverty and homelessness tend to be a valuable resource. Religious organizations, I kind of gave you the example of the minister in a Lutheran church, and there's a range of ways that some religious organizations help. The other thing in thinking about religious organizations also happens to be with resources. Oftentimes we don't think about them as a resource in terms of financial resources, but I have found, and through my experience in working in different programs over the years, is that some of the religious organizations have actually had financial resources that we've been able to capitalize on to bring into our program response. For instance, when I was the director of American Indian Community Housing up in Duluth, Minnesota, it was a small urban Indian program that we had an emergency shelter for battered women, a legal project, and a transitional housing program. And we communicated with a lot of the religious organizations in the community, and through that we got donations ranging from a few $100s to actually several thousands of dollars, which was really valuable. And then through those that were able to help us access some of the larger amounts of money, connected us to some of the regional and national religious assets. And then they were invaluable in some of the donations and stuff that we had. For instance, working in our emergency shelter for battered women, we actually had a church that on a regular basis made quilts for us. And so all of the women in our program, as they would come into shelter and we would set them up in their room, we put quilts on all of the beds, and then when the women left shelter, they took the quilts with them. So we really had a high demand for quilts because we wanted to give them something positive to kind of help them start off as they were moving into the next steps in their lives. The other thing we want to think about are the government assets. And I've listed them here, considering such as the Crime Lab or the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office, BIA and such. Through within the government assets, we have the realm of victim specialists. We might have people that are working within different departments that can really help us in terms of understanding some of the internal processes and protocols and help us to build the connections to strengthen the local response. And then finally, the cultural assets. And so as we think about the cultural assets, we want to think about what are going to be the supports for the population. So going back to where we started with the major ethnic, racial, and cultural groups, we want to really look at the cultural assets that can be used to really support the response. And so as we think about a victim or a survivor who is in trauma, what are the cultural assets that we can utilize? And so we're building it's all kind of an interconnected kind of web. So as I would go back and think about the institutional assets, that as we think about victims and survivors in trauma, we might want to help them connect with mental health facilities and behavioral health programs. But we also, with that, depending on her or his particular preferences, we want to also be able to connect them with some of their cultural assets so they can actually take care of their mental health and emotional and spiritual well-being and engage in the healing process in ways that are appropriate from within their own individual identities. And I just want to add a note of caution in terms of cultural assets is that as we think about them, the piece for me is always in thinking about them, we don't want to attempt to institutionalize them. They're kind of a community-based response, but not something that becomes institutionalized, but something that we build and organize the relationships in ways so they can be accessed based on the individual person's needs. So as I've thrown a lot of words at you, and as I've been thinking about this presentation, one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of give you an idea of a little bit of a starting point on it. And so I did some brainstorming around if we say that the point we want to look at is the domestic violence first point of assistance. So where in our community do victims of domestic violence make that first point, make that first connection in seeking assistance. So this first tier in here, we have 911, law enforcement, the informal support, the potential emergency room, potential clinic, potential advocacy program, and there may be others, but for the purpose of our discussion today, I'm just going to look at these. And then from there, so 911, if we're talking about the first point of assistance, then we're talking about, so someone's going to pick up the phone and make a phone call, and it's going to move through a dispatch for a law enforcement response and or a possible dispatch for a medical response. And those that respond, it'll depend on the jurisdiction and I listed in here the EMT from a non-native hospital. It could be from a tribal facility or Indian Health Service facility, and it depends on kind of the local response. And then law enforcement, as a person is seeking assistance, they could potentially, their first point of contact could be, again, thinking first point. So if they didn't call 911, their contact with law enforcement could be someone else called law enforcement, and then law enforcement shows on the scene, or somebody could walk into an agency to file a complaint or to also seek assistance. The informal support could be that they reach out to a family member or a friend or a coworker or a student peer to figure out what they want to do. And then the emergency room could be a walk-in situation. And then the clinic, as we think about the clinic, there's a few different ways that a person could make their first point or first reach out for assistance. And one is they could be in for a regular visit, maybe doing a physical or come in for lab work or whatever. And in that process, as the clinic is screening for domestic violence, then they screen positive. And so then that becomes a first point for possible assistance. Or they could just come in possibly for another situation as well, but through the contact with either the nurse or the doctor may make a direct request for assistance for domestic violence. And then lastly on this list is the advocacy program, where they could walk in and do a self-referral, or someone's referred them from a community organization or some other means that they get connected. Now, as we think about all of these different points, so then one of the things that this little bit of a picture of the community, and what we would want to do is label the programs. We'd want to know the name of the clinic and break it down a little more local. This is still kind of broad and generic. But as we think about that, the thing that this really emerges to me as I'm thinking about what we need to be working on in the community response, and I would be curious to know, is how equipped are each of these first responders to be able to respond? So are they able to provide a clear and competent response? And in particular, we look at, like even looking at the informal supports. As I look at those questions, it starts raising, or as I look at those that are identified under the purple line that shows the informal supports, what it raises for me is wondering how have we approached community education and awareness, and what are the beliefs around domestic violence and sexual assault for the purpose of this domestic violence in our community, so that as somebody who is a victim of domestic violence is reaching out for assistance, can reach out and receive something that's going to be helpful for them. Same thing, emergency room. A lot of times a lot of times when we think about the response, there are a lot of practitioners that we don't include in planning how we're going to train and educate and build the relationship with. So with the emergency room, I would really want to think about how have we included key emergency room personnel to be able to educate and provide appropriate referral. Now, we're not talking about that we want the emergency room person to carry the entire role as an advocate would, whose primary job is to respond to domestic violence. But we would want to consider whether or not they have enough working knowledge to be able to provide an effective response to a victim walking in. So we want to think about, and kind of just to reiterate a little bit of what I just said, so we want to think about it, what is happening in the community. So as we think about that whole picture, you know, what are some of the attitudes about it? What are the ways that people have been trained and educated? How are they included in the discussions around the responses? And how do they see their role? And as we think about the assets that we have at each of the points, we want to think about key personnel, training, their ability to respond in competent manners, and the supporting resources they may have to them, available to them. So such as the clinic, as we think about, as the clinic is being one of the first points of assistance, that we want to make sure that within the clinic personnel that would be communicating with a potential victim, that they actually have a clear understanding of how they could talk with this victim in a way that's helpful, and at the same time, how can they make appropriate referrals, and then the clinic would also want to know from within thinking about the advocacy program, how is the advocacy program as a responder? So a lot of times as we think about it, we can count the program. So we've got this program in our clinic, we've got that program with our advocacy program, and we can name these different programs, but a lot of times what happens is we don't fully understand how effective they are. And I'm somebody who's kind of a long-time advocate in my own life, but I also am a realist and know that not all advocacy programs work well, and not all responders work well. So that's an important part of, as we look at our community, we want to understand how well does it work. And in that, as we think about how well it works, then we want to start thinking about then what? Then what do we need to do? And so when I think about a community map, an asset map, the big point, the kind of a bottom line major point for me around why I would engage in developing a community map would be going back to the beginning of having a real solid understanding of the community response, so that I can actually develop strategies and solutions to the gaps and tap into the assets that I'm not tapped into already, and to make sure that as we look at this kind of web that we have, that the web is that different people are communicating and connecting in ways that don't allow people to fall through the different cracks that are there. So what I want to do is kind of just stop now. I know I've been talking quite a bit, and give an opportunity for people to ask any questions or make any comments. So we can just take an opportunity to make sure that you're getting information clarified or questions answered for yourself. So does anybody have any questions? And you can just jump right in and just speak up, or if you want to, you can raise your hand or type a chat message. And I'll take a drink of water. Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any questions at this time. We'll have another opportunity to have some questions. So the other area of mapping, I want to talk a little bit about that. So the other area gets into case processing. So as we think about the different kind of maps that we have, the last one that we were talking about really looked at the community and the assets and what we had available. So as we think about case processing, we're going to start looking at the steps that are involved. And as I consider that, then it's kind of like, okay, this happens, and then what happens next, and then what happens next. So when we think about case processing, we want to think about the steps, the different kind of things that take place at each point of intervention. But not only the steps, but we also want to think about who gets involved and when they get involved and what do they do when they get involved. And so again, it starts to become a web, but we want to be able to look at, so going back to the emergency room and someone comes in and is seeking assistance for domestic violence. Maybe they came in because they had some injuries and wanted some medical attention, but with that had some other kinds of, some other requests around possibly needing emergency shelter or wanting to understand a little bit about the legal process. So as we think about that particular point of intervention, then we want to think about, so what happens? So the person comes in and then what, the person makes a request. What would that emergency medical responder do? First off, the emergency medical responder most likely would assess the medical, the physical needs, and respond to that. And then the next step would be to discuss a little bit about the domestic violence that's going on. Most likely then the following step would be a referral. And so each responder will vary from community to community because the different structures within that facility are going to vary. So it's important to realize that. So you could go to the Navajo Nation and really look closely at the response, and then you could turn around and you could go over to Choctaw and look at the same response but see that it plays out differently. So there's variations in the response. One of the things that I did was I wanted to show you a few examples. Now this sample protocol actually comes from White Buffalo Calf Women's Society on the Rosebud Reservation. And it's a protocol that is shows case processing, so it shows the step, the point of intervention, and then what happens next, so to speak. So it starts in the beginning that there's a patient that's older than 14 years old, and then the next piece is they figure out, is there a child present? And if there's a child present, they ask, do you want the child to be present? And if no, then they call mental health or White Buffalo Calf staff to be with the kids. And if they say yes, then they move them to a private room. And you can see from this chart, and I realize that on some of your screens this might be small depending on the size of your screen, but it actually just walks through the different steps. Okay, so then after they're in the private room, they're going to ask a sequence of questions, and then if it comes up yes, they kind of stop to see if they're willing to continue being asked questions, and if yes, then they refer them or ask if they want to speak with somebody from White Buffalo Calf, and then they call a White Buffalo Calf staff to be present in the exam and continue on. If the person says no, then they offer a few other options. Would you like to talk to law enforcement? If yes, then they notify the law enforcement. If no, they continue to ask questions. Was there a deadly weapon involved? If yes, they call law enforcement. If no, would you like to speak to mental health? If yes, they call mental health. If no, would you like to speak to White Buffalo CAP? And I'm not going to go through, there's a few other pieces in here, but you kind of get the idea. So it shows the processing. In this particular case, processing sample shows you, it basically says this is what you're supposed to do. Now here's another example, and this is a sample response process of looking at a police report. And so this was developed in response to looking at systems issues and how the police report moved within the system and how that documented and spoke on behalf of the victim. And so it starts off by showing that from dispatch, dispatch from the communications center. There's the communication, dispatches the police department or the sheriff's department. From there, and then from that, then it moves into either law enforcement agency, and they go on to the scene. While they're on the scene, they interview the parties. They determine if probable cause exists. If it does, then they make arrest and transport the suspect to jail and notify the advocates. And then from being on the scene, then they work on the development of the police report, and in that they complete a warrantless arrest, probable cause affidavit. They dictate the report in the police department. In the sheriff's department, they write each individual writes the report. Then it goes for sergeant's approval. Then it moves into records management, and they notify appropriate agencies. And in this case, they notify either the advocacy program and DSS, which is the Department of Social Services, and they do that if children are present because they had a memorandum of understanding. So then the report, continuing to move forward, moves to the district attorney's office, and then they receive the notification of the arrest through the warrantless affidavit, and the report is delivered by the records management. The attorney reviews the file. The victim coordinator reviews the file, and a few more steps there, and then it moves into potential probation once the case has moved to disposition. And this actually kind of just shows kind of a flow, and one of the key pieces in this map is the linkages at the different points of when the different responders and what links the communication of the incident to the different responders. And so before the section on where it gets into what the report is, the previous pieces build the report, and then the report communicates what happened previously to the district attorney, the advocates program, the Department of Social Services, and probation. And so it's helpful to be able to see that so you can start to see how, is all the information that's supposed to be moving where it needs to be, and what the connections are. So as we think about the steps in case processing, we really want to anchor the chart in the lives of real people. And so when we think about that, we want to consider, for me, I like to imagine a particular person every time I've engaged in developing a case processing map. So I'll think about 2, 3, 4 different people and think about, well, what was their experience and how does that work? And in that, which goes back to a little bit of the community asset mapping, is the considerations for how might it vary if this woman is a different person. So for instance, I was working with a community in the Four Corners area, and we actually had a situation where you're working across 4 states. I think it was 6 tribes and 8 counties. And so with that, the point of intervention changes by virtue of who the person is and how they move. So say, for instance, if the initial, if we're looking at case processing that starts from the shelter there, and that was one of the primary people I was working with, and they're looking at kind of the legal response, the legal advocacy response of how do you support that person, and in that kind of follow-up medical care, follow-up mental health or behavioral health assistance, and trauma assistance, and maybe even spiritual support. In that, as you think about it, while the shelter is in the Utah corner of the Four Corners, that where they move in terms of the legal process is going to move depending on the jurisdiction. Where they're going to reach out to for the spiritual supports depends on tribal identity and tribal membership, and also maybe organized, kind of the organized religion faith that person may carry, if they carry that. And the same thing in terms of some of the mental health or behavioral health supports will depend on where they have access. So being able to keep it centered in the reality of individual people will really help you to create something that makes sense and is usable on a local level. What they did in the Four Corners area was they actually identified 6 composite women that were the potential, kind of the regular identities of women that they dealt with. And then they developed their case processing with those 6 composite women in mind. In their situation, because jurisdiction and the different boundaries were so complex, it was really critical for them to do 6 as opposed to 1 or 2. So now I just want to show you an example of a map system that can just show you kind of the way they can be really helpful. And what we're going into is a PowerPoint. For those of you that were at the annual meeting, it was in the materials. And then I know that following this presentation, Cinnamon's going to email out the PowerPoints as well. So if you didn't get it at the annual meeting, you'll get this shortly following this presentation. But this PowerPoint segment really starts to bring in an ability to start to see how different systems are engaged in a person's life. So this is specific to domestic violence. And so as we think about it, so in our minds we want to think about that there was a domestic violence incident. And so then from that, there was a call to 911, there was a law enforcement response, and then with that, a potential medical response, victim advocacy was notified, information was distributed from law enforcement. And then there's a path. Each path varies depending on the arrest and the lack of arrest. So if there's no arrest, there's some reporting that's filed, and then if there is an arrest, then there's a process that moves forward. And while we think about this, so this is a victim of domestic violence, and as we think about, well, the arrest is moving and it's dealing with the offender, the reality is that the victim gets pulled into the process at different points in there, where they're expected to engage, to offer information, and sometimes to be a witness in what follows. So as we think about it, so law enforcement responds in here, and there was a domestic and an arrest incident. So from that, as we think about, she reached out and called 911, and as a result of that, seeks shelter. So as she seeks shelter, she may move into a shelter intake process, and depending if she has children, a child advocate may be involved, a woman's advocate would be involved, and then the shelter itself has a range of different expectations of her, where they would hook her up and refer her, as well as help her set appointments and different kinds of things, to community resources, and then internal resources with such as a house meeting talking about house chores, who's cooking dinner tonight, different kinds of things like that. If she's got children, then there may be discussions around children, and a range of different education groups taking place, as well as some shelters are doing different types of assessments and encouragements to different kinds of things around being healthy, different types of things for her own well-being, and emotional, helping her to recover from the emotional trauma, and as well as including some spiritual supports and traditional medicine supports in her process. So she went to shelter. The other thing that happened was, because of the incident, potentially Child Protective Services can be started. So one of the things that I've found in my travels around the country is that many communities have been moving toward developing relationships between law enforcement and Child Protective Services, so that when children are on the scene of a domestic, Child Protective Services is called and often intervenes to protect the children. And while that on the surface sounds very helpful, it can actually be very problematic, because what's happening then is Child Protective Services often gets involved in an attempt to keep the children safe, but what ends up happening is that there's more times than not an effort that ends up holding her accountable for children's safety and not holding the offender accountable for creating any kind of risks to the children. So in that, so she still has the children with her, so that's where it starts becoming problematic. So she's got the children with her. They're coming in, doing a child welfare assessment, and then with that, they may decide that they want to take it to a few more steps, and in that risk assessment, safety assessments, they start moving towards possibly placing children in protective custody of the legal systems. And so with that, there's multiple steps that take place regardless of how far it goes through that case process. It requires a level of engagement and responsibility of the victim to respond to that system to ensure that the children are safe. And then also, still talking about the same incident, if she's living in tribal housing, one of the things that could happen is there could be a potential issue over the fact that there was either community disturbance as a result of the domestic violence, or even through the domestic violence there was damage to the property. And what we've seen is that sometimes there's a warning given, sometimes it moves a little bit faster, and with that, a victim may potentially be facing an eviction. And so tribal housing ends up starting to be engaged, trying to look at whether or not they want to continue with her in the housing. One of the things that I know from my experience working with victims is that oftentimes, like a lot of people will say, well, why does she stay in that relationship if that's going on? My experience in working with victims is we find that they leave numerous times before the relationship finally severs. And if you were at the annual meeting, you saw Don Chapin do quite a wonderful presentation that really highlighted the enormous amounts of barriers. And so with that, you've got a situation where her housing is starting to become in jeopardy as a result of his actions. So even if he finally leaves the house, she still has to deal with the repercussions of his actions within that system. If he leaves through the arrest but then returns, so then she's still dealing with the tribal housing in terms of what all of that means. And sometimes there's even a financial burden that goes with it in terms of any damage to property that he did. And I've seen where women have left the program, or he has left the house, and then with that she's responsible for the financial burdens. So again, back to the 911 call, the incident that took place. She had reached out, advocacy was referred, and then through that, there's a decision that she may want a protection order to protect her from his being around her. And so with that, there are multiple steps within the court system where she herself needs to appear in court. Well, first she needs to file the paperwork. Then she needs to get a judge to sign it. And then with that, the paperwork needs to be served to the respondent. And then there's a civil court hearing process. Now, sometimes if an offender decides to get an attorney, the civil court hearing process could become lengthy as a result of that. So then once the protection order is granted, again, there's notification of the victim that the protection order was granted. And with that, there might be some reliefs in there depending on the local court systems itself, whether or not, sometimes they take care of custody decisions, some short-term temporary custody, just saying that she has custody, sometimes saying that she can stay in the house that was theirs, that you have to do some visit, allow for him to have visits of the children, and a range of different things like that. So then, again, she went in, there was a domestic violence incident, and in this case she had been married to him, and so she's severing the relationship and may file for divorce, and in that goes into a court hearing, seeks temporary custody while she's working toward long-term custody of the children. And in that, then it activates a whole other court process that gets into looking at custody evaluation, interviews by an evaluator or guardian ad litem who wants to look at to see who's going to be the best parent to have the children in their custody. And so there's multiple steps in there in terms of being engaged with the court to look at that, provide documentation, make yourself available to have discussions, to share information. So what we want to remember was there was a violent incident. And as a result of that violent incident, multiple systems were activated. And this, to me, when we think about case processing, what's helpful is to be able to start to see how while one case is acting, another one is also acting. And all of these cases that you're all seeing in front of us, all of these case processing maps, started because of a 911 call. And so, and everybody's situation is a little different. So maybe one woman might not have the housing issues. Maybe another won't have the custody or child protective services issues because her children or she doesn't have children with her. So there's always going to be variations, and then each local map is going to look differently. But the bottom line point is that there was a domestic violence incident, and multiple systems started acting, and in that, it's had a major impact on her life. And so we also have to think about, and these are institutional responses. And so as we think about the responses in the community, we also want to think about what are the ways that the system is taking into account her lived situation. So for instance, one of the things that I think about is that what this map doesn't show is the children and what's going on at the school system with little Timmy, who's 8 years old and acting out in school. Or it doesn't show this system, these maps don't show the fact that the stress of living with the violence over time is manifesting itself through physical conditions. Maybe she's suffering from migraines and having to go to the doctor to deal with the migraines as well as the time that she's not able to respond. So, and there's a range of different kind of things that can be showing up. So it's a really good illustrator to start to see the multiple systems, and our role is to minimize the negative impact. So as we look at the systems that respond, we are not going to want to stop and remove all these systems because each of them have a role and a critical role. But what we want to do is to look at how one system is acting while another is acting and work in ways to remove the negative impacts. So as we think about the case processing, we want to think about how it accounts for the complexity of risk and safety, which gets into a little bit of some of the stuff that I mentioned about little Timmy acting out in school and things like that. But we want to think about it on 4 different levels. So risks that are generated by the offender. So how is this case processing, how, as we create our maps, we're going to want to look at it on how that accounts for what the offender can do that can create risk and endangerment for her and her children. Then we also want to think about the victim survivor's immediate personal circumstances. Now that gets into little Timmy acting out in school and the migraine kind of issues that she's struggling with, and the fact that she's, her mother just passed away. Just all of the different kind of things that are going on in her own lived experience that is not a part of the domestic violence, but because it's happening at the same time, it's intertwined with the response to the domestic violence. And then we want to think about aspects of culture. And in there, we want to think about what does she need that within her own cultural identity that can support her, and how are these systems acting in ways to support her or potentially acting in barriers to her receiving the cultural supports that she needs as she moves through those. So for instance, as we think about the cultural supports, one of the things that is a practice in a shelter that's a common thing that happens is that if you are not in, one of the common rules that I see in many shelters is if you are not in your bed at midnight, you lose your bed. So a shelter that has 10 beds for emergency shelter for battered women has 10 beds, and say she ended up needing to go away for a few days for ceremony purposes to restore balance back into her life, she could lose her bed at the emergency shelter. So then she's in a position of having to choose between spiritual support or even traditional medicine and emergency shelter. And that's a hard choice to make. And so we want to be thinking about, as we think about aspects of culture, how, what kind of ways, what aspects of culture will she be engaged with, things that are reflected in her own cultural identity that she needs to support her, and just even regular lived functioning that are clashing with the systems response. So the systems response is operating in a way that doesn't account for that. And then also the institutional intervention. So we want to think about the institutional intervention and what kind of risks it creates. So for instance, another situation in an institutional intervention that could create a risk. So we think about protection orders as being one of the safe remedies for victims. And yet at the same time, some places in their protection order practice, they require the address of the person who is seeking the protection order. And so if you're a victim of domestic violence and you're trying to flee for safety and you're required to put your address on the protection order paperwork that gets served to the offender, right there you've got a risk. So the case processing starts to help opening up some of those kinds of risks that we can look at so that we can actually start creating some remedies for it. And in that, we really want to think about that at multiple steps within the response. So we can think about it broadly, but the mapping actually helps to get us to start thinking about, so at this point, how is this helpful? How is this helpful? How is this creating risks? How does it account for risk and safety for the victim? Some more clues also is to think about the sequencing of case processing and, stuff that I mentioned before about intervening when the intervention happens, where it happens, how it happens, each step taking into account what happens, and the intersecting processes that are involved. And the intersecting processes, I think, are really critical because as we go back to looking at what's happening in this woman's life who there was a domestic violence incident and the systems all activated around her, we can see that it's really critical that we start to look at how the systems are intersecting so that we can do it in a way that minimizes the negative impact. So I want to stop again for some questions or comments to see if anybody has anything on their mind that they would like to ask or share as a result of what we've been talking about.
Vicki, this is Cinnamon. I have a question. So in looking at this whole process, this can be used for areas that have a current protocol in place, as well as if they are reviewing their protocols or looking at updating their protocols?
Yes, exactly. Just going back to the protocol that White Buffalo Calf had, that a lot of times what people will do is they'll write their protocol up, a page or two kind of right above their protocol. Having the visual chart is really, really valuable. So if they've got a protocol in place, I really strongly encourage people to map it, to lay it out, to show the visual, because as you look at the map, then you start to see a little bit of, oh, we missed this spot, or maybe we should add that. And if you've got the protocol in place and you're ready to review it and you haven't mapped it, being able to map it and you sit down, not just one person, but a small group of people that are involved in the different points, the different action steps, to sit down and map it together would be really helpful, because then you can talk about how is this working, how does that work, how does that help, what else needs to be listed in here, and is that having a potential issue or creating a potential risk. In this case, with following the police report, one of the things that we saw as we were mapping things out, and this is the map, not the finished map, this was the map when we were mapping it out, and what we saw was that with the police report in this particular area, they were having high numbers of dual arrests and of man and woman engaged in a fight, arrest them both for using force. And what we saw was that if they looked at and accounted for the elements of the predominant aggressor statute, it would actually minimize the number of dual arrests, which bottom line, dual arrests are problematic. And so by being able to recognize that that piece wasn't accounted for, we were able to minimize the negative impact of dual arrest to victims and actually created more safety for victims.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the piece that you said about looking at the responses of the community, people, the ER, the clinics, everyone and anyone who is responding to victims, and really looking at, is their response effective? Is it an effective response? So I like that piece. Thank you.
Thanks, Cinnamon. And I do want to say, because as I think about it, and I've been doing maps for years, and that sometimes it might feel daunting to some people to kind of start, especially when you see a map like this, then you're kind of like, holy cow, that's a lot. That's going to be a lot of work on our level. So the thing that the best advice I can give anybody is to start small. As you start to define what you're looking at, break it down and into a smaller piece, because one piece will build onto another piece, which will build onto another piece. So what do you need most now? And move from that place and then build on it. Because you don't have to try to accomplish the whole thing at one time. So like the maps that we have here, those were developed over several years, where we started off by looking at the arrest response. Then we moved to looking at the advocacy response, and slowly moved from one response to the other and built on it. And so I really encourage people to think about it as kind of a layering approach, by looking at what's most important for you and in your work and in your community, and then moving from there. Do what's most important, and then move to next importance, and on and on. And that ought to keep you busy for a few years. Any other questions or comments? Well, it looks like we have no other questions or comments, so we'll go ahead and wrap up today's call. And I just want to thank everybody for being on the call today. And there will be a follow-up email that will go out that will send out the PowerPoints to everybody. So thanks for being here. And if you do have any questions, or if you do have any other questions that you didn't ask now, if you're thinking about it later or you're talking with another group, you can definitely reach us at our phone number that's listed on the slide, as well as our general email address at dvpi@red-wind.net, and we can answer your questions. The other thing that I just want to throw out from a TA perspective is that I keep talking about customized or custom-made, custom-designed technical assistance. So if you decide you want to work on some mapping in your own community and you want a little help with it, you can pull together a small team, and we can do some conference calls and talk about it and work with you to help support you in your effort. So thanks, everybody. I hope you're having a nice, cool day because of how hot it is around the country, and have a nice rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you. Please stand by.